Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The restaurant was one of those upscale places with white tablecloths so stiffly starched they could slice your finger, the kind of place my family only ever stepped into when there was something to show off about, or someone to tear down. That night, it was supposed to be about celebrating my promotion. Supposed to be. My parents had planned the dinner, trying their best to make it special, though I knew deep down they were more nervous than proud. They understood how my family worked. Or rather, how Aunt Cheryl worked. They had warned me to brace myself. And as usual, they were right. We were halfway through the appetizers when she struck. I should have seen it coming. Aunt Cheryl always waited until there were just enough people at the table, just enough wine in her glass, and just enough silence for her voice to cut through like a blade. She leaned back in her chair, swirling her Chardonnay like she was some kind of queen surveying a court, and said loudly, too loudly, really, like she wanted to make sure even the table next to us heard her, "Funny they picked you for the position. Your cousin is clearly the smarter one." I felt the heat crawl up my neck before the words had even finished hanging in the air. For a split second, the entire table went quiet. You could almost hear the clink of silverware stop midair. I looked across at Lana, my cousin, who wore that smug half-smile she always saved for moments like this. She didn't say anything, of course, she never had to. Aunt Cheryl did her dirty work for her, always had. Lana just sat there, perfectly manicured fingers tapping her wine glass, soaking in the moment like she was entitled to it. I forced a smile, the kind you give when you've heard the same insult so many times it's almost muscle memory to pretend it doesn't sting. But it did. It always did. I glanced at my mom, who looked down at her plate like she wanted to disappear into it. My dad shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, clearly fighting the urge to say something but knowing it wouldn't help. And then I did what I always did in moments like this. I played it cool. I smiled wider, leaned forward slightly, and said, "Well, apparently, they didn't get the memo." A few people chuckled nervously. My aunt raised an eyebrow, but I didn't give her time to respond. I turned to Lana and asked how her new role was going, feigning genuine interest, even though I already knew. And oh, I knew everything. I knew she was struggling. I knew she was in way over her head. And most importantly, I knew that she had only gotten the job because I recommended her. But we'll get to that. In that moment, though, I wasn't thinking about the long game. I was thinking about every single dinner like this one where Aunt Cheryl had made me feel like a placeholder. Like my accomplishments were cute little hobbies. Like Lana was the standard, and I was the reminder that not everyone was born to shine. I remembered being 10 years old and coming home with a science fair ribbon, only to hear Aunt Cheryl say, "Well, it's not a trophy, is it?" I remembered getting into college on a scholarship and hearing her mutter, "That school accepts anyone these days." And I remembered sitting in this same restaurant 4 years ago, watching her toast to Lana's promotion while pretending not to notice I'd just been laid off. But this time was different. Because this time, I wasn't sitting quietly in my own shadow. I had spent the last 2 years clawing my way up, working insane hours, delivering projects no one else could touch, mentoring staff who were now getting promoted themselves. I hadn't just earned my new role, I had built it from the ground up. And whether Aunt Cheryl wanted to admit it or not, there wasn't a single person in that company who thought I didn't deserve it. Except maybe Lana. But again, she didn't count. Not really. I glanced at the entrance just as the restaurant doors swung open. The timing was perfect, almost cinematic. My CEO, Mr. Dalton, walked in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on our table. He smiled when he saw me, making his way through the crowd without hesitation. Aunt Cheryl's voice faltered mid-sentence, watching him approach with a look of cautious curiosity. When he reached our table, he extended his hand toward me and said, loud and clear, "Congratulations again on the promotion. And thank you for recommending your cousin as your assistant." That was a thoughtful gesture. You could have heard a pin drop. I shook his hand, smiled, and replied, "Of course. I always try to support family." Aunt Cheryl's expression shifted instantly, from smug superiority to utter confusion, then something I couldn't quite describe. Shock, maybe. Embarrassment. Maybe even fear. Her eyes darted from me to Lana and back again, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle that no longer made sense. Lana's face was pale, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. For the first time in years, neither of them had anything to say. And I hadn't even started yet. But oh, if she only knew what came next. It's strange how certain moments in your life don't ever really leave you, even when you've outgrown the house, the town, and all the people who thought they could define you. No matter how far you run or how high you climb, some shadows just stretch long behind you, refusing to loosen their grip. Sitting at that dinner table, fake laughing at my aunt's snide comments and Lana's smug expression, I felt those old ghosts creeping back in like they'd never left. That same tightness in my chest, that same ache in my throat, that same quiet voice whispering, "You don't belong here." Not really. And the thing is, I'd spent most of my childhood learning how to breathe through that kind of silence. I remember being maybe 7 years old, sitting at the kids' table during one of our extended family Sunday dinners, those long, chaotic meals that Aunt Cheryl orchestrated like some kind of social opera. The adults always sat in the dining room, laughing too loud and drinking just enough to forget how sharp their words could get. The kids were shoved into the kitchen with mismatched chairs and plastic plates, but even there, hierarchy ruled. Lana, 2 years younger, but always treated like royalty, never missed a chance to remind me who really mattered. If I brought a drawing I was proud of, hers was more detailed. If I told a story, hers was more imaginative. And if I so much as hinted at feeling proud of anything I'd done, Aunt Cheryl was there to roll her eyes and remind everyone that some kids just try too hard for attention. It didn't stop at childhood either. It just evolved, like everything toxic does. In high school, I busted my ass for grades while Lana coasted on charm and connections. I studied late, missed parties, volunteered after school, all in this desperate attempt to prove I was worth noticing. But every time my name was mentioned at those family dinners, Aunt Cheryl would smile that smug little smile and say something like, "Well, academics aren't everything. Lana's a people person. She's got charisma. That's what gets you far in life." I wanted to scream that I had charisma too, I just wasn't allowed to show it. Not in a house where Lana's every mediocre effort was applauded like a standing ovation, while my achievements were barely met with a nod. There was this one moment that still stings more than I care to admit. Junior year, I just won a regional science competition, a big deal, the kind of thing that came with a scholarship offer and a local news feature. I came to dinner with a spark in my chest, thinking maybe this time, maybe finally, Aunt Cheryl would say something decent. Instead, before I could even open my mouth, she launched into a story about Lana being chosen as a backup dancer in some community center recital. Everyone clapped. Everyone smiled. No one asked me a single question about my project. I sat there, holding my certificate in my lap under the table, while Lana described her sparkly costume in excruciating detail. I remember going home that night and locking myself in my room, staring at that certificate and wondering what the hell it was worth if the people who raised you couldn't even see you. And don't even get me started on college. I worked 2 jobs to get through school while Lana bounced from one life discovery break to another, changing majors like hairstyles and still managing to land internships because Aunt Cheryl knew someone who knew someone. When I graduated magna cum laude, Aunt Cheryl congratulated me with a lukewarm, "Well, let's hope you find a job that actually uses that degree." Meanwhile, when Lana finally managed to complete a basic business certificate course, they threw her a catered party. Have you ever had a family member who made you feel small, like no matter how hard you tried, you'd always be second place? I'd love to know I'm not alone in that. Because if you've ever sat in a room full of people who pretend you're invisible while cheering for someone who barely tried, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that cold, hollow feeling in your gut, like you're screaming underwater and nobody's listening. You know the burn in your throat from swallowing every comeback, every sarcastic remark, every ounce of rage, just to keep the peace. And you know what it's like to smile through it, pretending it doesn't matter, pretending you're the bigger person. But something shifted in me that night at the restaurant. As Aunt Cheryl's words hung in the air and I watched Lana bask in the attention like always, I realized I wasn't that little girl anymore, sitting quietly at the kids' table hoping someone would notice her ribbon. I was a grown woman with power, with position, with leverage. I wasn't just the promoted one, I was the one who held the strings now. And the best part was, they didn't even realize I was holding them. So I leaned back in my chair, laughed lightly at some joke I didn't hear, and kept playing my role. I let them think I was still that quiet, overachieving girl desperate for approval. But inside, I was already several steps ahead. Because what none of them knew, what not even Lana knew, was that I had already set my plan in motion 2 months earlier. People often assume revenge has to be loud, theatrical, and explosive, but I've learned over the years that the most effective kind is quiet, precise, and almost invisible until the very end. Like a trapdoor you don't even notice until your feet are already off the ground. When I found out I was being considered for the director role at my firm, I didn't just celebrate, I strategized. Because I knew that with my new position would come influence, and with influence came the opportunity to play the long game the way it was meant to be played, deliberately, patiently, and with surgical accuracy. You see, most people spend their time trying to prove their worth to the world, but I had already spent years doing that, years of late nights, impossible deadlines, and turning messes into milestones. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. What I needed was a way to finally expose the rot that had been hiding under a polished surface for far too long. And Lana, bless her smug little heart, gave me that opening without even realizing it. It started subtly, months before the promotion was finalized. Back then, Lana was floating between jobs again, talking endlessly about her next big move, without ever doing anything concrete. During one of those unbearable family brunches, she casually mentioned that she was thinking of getting into the corporate world for a while, just to see what it's like. I didn't flinch. I didn't laugh. I just smiled and said, we might have something at my firm. Nothing too high level, but it could be a good entry point. Her eyes lit up with that entitled sparkle I'd seen 100 times before. To Lana, an entry point wasn't just a job, it was a temporary inconvenience on her inevitable climb to something bigger. She asked a few shallow questions, nodded thoughtfully, and agreed to send over her resume, though it clearly hadn't been touched in years. I passed it along to HR with a brief note, family connection, worth considering. Has potential, but may need development. That was all it took. My CEO, Mr. Dalton, respected my judgment immensely by that point. If I said someone had potential, he believed it. He trusted my instincts because I had earned that trust 100 times over. And so, just like that, Lana was offered the assistant role to the department director, me. She accepted with a surprising amount of enthusiasm, likely imagining it as some kind of fast track to executive life. During her first week, she wore heels that were far too high and asked questions that were far too shallow. She floated through meetings with a notepad she barely touched and handed in work that looked polished at first glance but collapsed under scrutiny. I didn't push too hard. Not at first. I needed her to feel comfortable, confident, maybe even a little smug. I needed her to believe she was climbing. Then, slowly, I started assigning her tasks that weren't just administrative. They were layered, technical, and quietly complex. Budget forecasting with multi-tier analysis. Drafting reports with cross-departmental insights. Scheduling cross-functional team reviews where she had to manage not just calendars, but egos. And every time she failed, and she did, over and over again, I didn't yell. I didn't scold. I simply offered more training sessions, more resources, and more chances to succeed, all while documenting everything meticulously. To her credit, she tried to keep up. But there's only so much charm can do when you're swimming in a sea of deadlines and deliverables. Eventually, the cracks began to show. She missed key data inputs. She bungled vendor correspondence. She even scheduled a client meeting during a national holiday. Each mistake chipped away at the illusion of competence she tried so hard to maintain. Mr. Dalton started noticing. He wasn't the kind of leader who micromanaged, but he wasn't blind either. During a quarterly review meeting, he leaned over and quietly asked me, "Is she managing all right? Seems like she's struggling to keep up." I gave him a carefully measured nod, just enough concern to imply I was still hopeful but also honest. "She's bright," I said softly, "but I think she's realizing this isn't as simple as it looks on paper." And the truth was, it never was. Real work required real grit, something Lana had never been forced to develop. All her life, people had carried her, cleared the path for her, made excuses for her failures. But in my department, under my watch, there was no safety net, only results. And results didn't care about family trees or childhood favoritism. Still, I didn't push too fast. I wanted her unraveling to be gradual, undeniable, and most importantly, self-inflicted. The more she failed, the more obvious it became that she didn't belong. And the more she tried to overcompensate, the more glaring her limitations grew. By the time Mr. Dalton started asking questions, I already had every email, every report, every missed deadline cataloged and organized like a case file. But the real punch was still to come, and it was going to sting. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in watching a person fall apart slowly, especially when they've spent their entire life walking around like the world owed them applause. Lana had always been the kind of woman who wore her entitlement like a designer coat, tailored, confident, and just loud enough to make sure everyone noticed. But there's one thing entitlement can never substitute, and that's competence. And when the smoke and mirrors begin to fade, what's left behind is the truth, and the truth, in Lana's case, wasn't particularly impressive. It started with little things, the kind of mistakes most people might overlook at first. A few late emails, a typo in a report header, a missed update on a shared calendar. I didn't say much when it began. I simply made a note of each one in a private file I kept tucked away on my desktop. Not for revenge exactly, at least not at first. It was more about protecting myself. After all, she worked directly under me, and if things went sideways, it would be my name on the line, not hers. But deep down, I also knew that this file, this growing, detailed list of her errors, would eventually become something far more powerful than just insurance. Then the mistakes became harder to ignore. She forgot to send an agenda to a client before a major meeting, which left our entire team scrambling at the last minute. She submitted a report with outdated figures, causing confusion that rippled through several departments. She stumbled during a presentation, losing her train of thought halfway through, then tried to blame the slides I had prepared, slides I had double-checked twice before the meeting even began. I watched her flounder with the kind of neutral expression I had perfected over years of being underestimated, calm, collected, and just detached enough to avoid suspicion. All the while, Aunt Cheryl kept bragging at family gatherings about Lana's brilliant future and how it wouldn't be long before she outgrew that assistant role and moved into something bigger. I smiled politely and said nothing. I let her have her moment because I knew what was coming. And God, it was going to be sweet. At work, whispers began to circulate. Nothing overt at first, just quiet conversations in the break room, a few raised eyebrows during meetings, lingering looks exchanged across conference tables. People were noticing, and not just the mistakes, people were noticing how I handled them. How I remained calm, how I stepped in when necessary, how I subtly cleaned up her messes without making it obvious. The staff respected me already, but now they were watching me closely, seeing the contrast between my discipline and her disarray, and that contrast was becoming more striking with every passing week. Lana, oblivious as always, seemed to think her charisma would smooth over everything. She tried to charm her way through every blunder, deflecting questions with vague answers and redirecting conversations whenever someone brought up details she couldn't explain. It worked for a while. After all, people like her have always managed to skate by on confidence, but it was becoming clearer by the day that she was in over her head. Mr. Dalton started asking more questions. Nothing aggressive, just subtle check-ins. How's the team adapting? Is everyone pulling their weight? Anything I should be aware of? I kept my answers balanced, never directly throwing her under the bus, just highlighting patterns, pointing out gaps, mentioning areas that could use additional development. And always, I said it with a tone of concern, never condescension, because that's how you make people listen, by appearing objective, even when every word is laced with quiet judgment. Eventually, he asked me for something more formal. A discreet report, he said. Nothing official yet, just a summary of team performance. I nodded and said I'd put something together by the end of the week. But what I handed him wasn't just a summary. It was a carefully constructed, deeply detailed record of every missed deadline, every misstep, every poorly handled task, complete with timelines, examples, and consequences. It wasn't vindictive, it was factual. Cold, clear, and impossible to argue against. I didn't write it with venom. I wrote it with precision. Because I knew that when it landed on his desk, there would be no way to ignore what it revealed. A few days later, he called me into his office. He had the report in front of him, a red pen in his hand, his brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. He looked up at me, not angry, not even surprised, just thoughtful. He tapped a page with his finger and said, I had no idea it was this extensive. I met his gaze and said, she's not a bad person. But she's not equipped for this role. He nodded slowly, eyes drifting back to the report. You've been covering for her, haven't you? I didn't answer right away. I just let the silence sit between us until he finally leaned back in his chair and sighed. All right, he said. We'll need to take next steps. And just like that, the tide turned. But I hadn't done all that work just to watch her get reassigned quietly or cushioned into some softer role where she could coast again. No, I wasn't finished yet. The final stage required more than just exposure, it required impact. I wanted her to feel it, to sit with the weight of everything she had taken for granted, to understand, finally and completely, that there are consequences for riding other people's coattails. And I gave him something he didn't expect, something that turned everything upside down. Some conversations don't need to be loud to carry weight, and some meetings don't need to last long to leave a lasting impact. The morning of my meeting with Mr. Dalton was crisp, the kind of morning that makes you feel like something is shifting in the air, even if you can't quite name what it is. I arrived early, as always, walked into the office with my usual calm expression, and greeted the receptionist with a nod that probably didn't hint at the storm I was about to quietly unleash. This wasn't just another progress update. This was a turning point, the quiet tip of the final domino before the rest began to fall. When I stepped into Mr. Dalton's office, he was already reviewing the file I had prepared, the one I'd spent hours compiling, cross-referencing emails, calendar mishaps, botched project notes, missed communications, and half-baked reports. It was the kind of evidence that didn't scream or dramatize. It simply existed, undeniable and damning in its calm, orderly presentation. He didn't speak for the first few minutes, just kept flipping through page after page, occasionally jotting down a note or underlining a sentence. I watched the subtle changes in his posture, how his shoulders tensed slightly, how his brow furrowed deeper, how he exhaled just a bit too long after reading a paragraph that summarized one of Lana's most glaring blunders. Finally, he looked up at me and said, I knew she was struggling, but I didn't realize it was this extensive. His voice wasn't angry, just heavy with a kind of tired disappointment. That kind of disappointment hits harder than yelling ever could. I kept my tone even, composed. She's tried, but this role was never a good fit for her. I've stepped in where I could, but it's reached a point where her presence is slowing down the team. Mr. Dalton nodded slowly, tapping the corner of the file with his pen. And you've been covering for her this whole time, haven't you? I didn't deny it. I didn't need to. He already knew. It was written between every line in that file. The late-night emails I'd sent to fix her errors. The last-minute corrections I'd made before reports went to the board. The impromptu meetings I'd scheduled to smooth over messes she'd caused. It was all there, and he saw it now, plain as day. She's going to need to be addressed, he said, almost to himself. Then he looked at me again, more directly this time. Would you prefer I handle it, or would you like to have the conversation yourself? That question surprised me, even though it shouldn't have. It was a mark of respect, a subtle acknowledgement that I had earned the right to lead, not just manage. But I shook my head and said, "It should come from you." "She won't take it seriously coming from me. She'll think it's personal." He agreed, and the conversation ended there, quick, clean, and final. Lana was called into his office the following morning, and from my desk I could see the stiffness in her posture as she walked past, that careful poise she always carried like armor. She came out 20 minutes later with her eyes red and glassy, walking faster than usual, avoiding everyone's gaze, clutching her handbag with a grip that looked like it might leave bruises on her knuckles. She didn't come back to her desk that day. She didn't even speak to me. And honestly, I didn't expect her to. Later that week, during a department-wide meeting, Mr. Dalton took a moment to recognize my leadership under pressure, how I'd maintained operations seamlessly despite unexpected internal challenges. The team clapped, a few people smiled in that knowing way that told me they understood exactly what had happened, even if no one dared say it out loud. That's the thing about quiet power, it doesn't need a spotlight to be noticed. It radiates from how you handle chaos, how you stand steady when everything else starts to wobble. That night, I got a phone call from Aunt Cheryl. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering, already bracing myself for the shrill panic I knew would greet me on the other end. "What's going on with Lana at your job?" she demanded, skipping any kind of greeting, voice sharp and rattled. I kept my voice light, almost amused. "Oh!" I thought she said everything was going great. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to taste the bitterness in her silence. "She's not answering my calls. She came home crying and won't tell me anything." I let that silence stretch for a beat longer before replying, "Maybe it's just a rough week. You know how corporate life can be. Not everyone adjusts the same way." Another silence followed, this one heavier, weighed down with confusion and suspicion. "Did something happen?" I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that makes a person question whether you're mocking them or just amused by their ignorance. "I'm sure if anything serious had happened, she'd tell you. She's your brilliant rising star, remember." She didn't respond to that. She just mumbled something about needing to go and hung up a few seconds later. I stared at the phone for a while after that, thinking about how many times I'd walked away from her cruelty with a smile on my face and a wound in my chest. But not this time. This time, the wound wasn't mine. This time, I wasn't the one swallowing my pride or hiding my tears. And something about that balance shift felt almost holy. But I wasn't finished yet. The final scene had to be public. There are moments in life when silence holds more weight than 1,000 screaming words, and that evening, sitting at that heavy oak table beneath the restaurant's dim chandeliers, every breath felt wrapped in thick tension. The kind of tension that clings to your skin, that makes forks pause halfway to mouths, that keeps glances sharp and words careful. Everyone was still reeling from Mr. Dalton's sudden appearance and the loaded statement he had delivered with such casual precision, and though conversation continued in polite fragments, it was clear that something had shifted in the atmosphere. Something unspoken had found its way to the center of the table and settled itself between the wine glasses and linen napkins like an unwelcome but undeniable guest. Aunt Cheryl, for all her years of passive-aggressive mastery, was visibly shaken. She tried to recover quickly, clearing her throat, dabbing the corner of her mouth with her napkin, and letting out one of those forced, shrill laughs that made her sound more like a woman who had slipped on ice than one enjoying herself. She turned to Lana, murmuring something that I couldn't quite catch but didn't need to hear to understand. Lana, in contrast, didn't speak at all. She just stared blankly at her water glass, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes occasionally flicking toward me like she was trying to piece together how everything had spun out of her control. Mr. Dalton remained at our table for a few more minutes, just long enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. He clinked his spoon gently against his glass and gave a brief but memorable speech, the kind that sounds polite on the surface but carries sharp edges beneath the polish. "I just wanted to take a moment," he began, "to acknowledge the extraordinary leadership we've seen from this woman over the past year. Her clarity, her composure under pressure, her ability to mentor and guide even the less experienced hires," and here he paused just slightly, just long enough for the meaning to register before continuing, has been invaluable to our team's success. The room stayed quiet, but not empty. The silence swelled with understanding. His words hadn't been an accident, nor had that particular phrasing. He didn't look directly at Lana when he said it, but his eyes found her immediately afterward, lingering just long enough for her to feel the weight of everything he hadn't said out loud. It was, perhaps, the most refined form of public humiliation I had ever witnessed, elegant, understated, and brutally effective. I raised my glass then, because moments like that deserved punctuation. I stood slowly, letting the rustle of my chair draw attention without effort. I lifted my glass high enough to catch the light, smiled just wide enough to look warm but not forgiving, and said clearly, to growth, some of us rise, and some of us reveal what's underneath when the light hits. There was a beat of stillness after my words, followed by a few hesitant chuckles, and then a wave of more genuine laughter from those who had, by now, put all the puzzle pieces together. Aunt Cheryl tried to join in the laughter, her mouth curled into an odd, twitching smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked around the table, searching for someone to mirror her attempt at composure, but no one returned the gesture. Even the usual family sycophants seemed to shrink away from her, suddenly unsure of which side of the story they wanted to be associated with. Lana, meanwhile, pushed her chair back with just a little too much force and stood abruptly. She mumbled something about needing air and disappeared toward the restroom, but she didn't return for the rest of the evening. After dessert, Aunt Cheryl made one final effort to recover the dignity she had so spectacularly lost. She leaned in toward me and said, in a voice just low enough to pretend it was meant to be sincere, "You've done well, dear. You really have." I didn't bother responding. I just nodded, raised my glass again in mock gratitude, and turned my attention back to my colleagues who were still seated nearby, people who had actually earned their seats at that table. Later that night, as the restaurant lights dimmed and guests filtered out into the cool evening air, I walked to my car with a strange mix of satisfaction and stillness. Not the gloating kind of satisfaction that comes from vengeance served hot, but the quiet, dignified kind that rises from watching the truth finally speak for itself without needing your voice to carry it. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to point fingers or issue ultimatums. I had simply laid out the facts, let the failures unfold naturally, and allowed the weight of reality to do what my words never could. The following week, Lana submitted her resignation without much fanfare. No farewell lunch, no heartfelt goodbyes, not even a LinkedIn post. She simply vanished from the office like a dropped thread no one bothered to pick up again. No one asked questions. No one needed to. It was understood. She had been revealed for what she truly was, and there was no repairing that image once the cracks had been exposed. As for Aunt Cheryl, she hasn't brought her up again. Not once. Not even in passing. It's as if Lana's brief career at my firm has been erased from the family narrative entirely, replaced by awkward pauses and changed subjects every time someone ventures too close to the topic. And I've let it stay that way. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's just letting the truth show itself and watching who crumbles under it. I never needed to win a war. I just needed the masks to fall. And sometimes silence is the best victory speech.